Good morning. Good morning. I think we have enough chairs. If more people come, we can do that. So my name's Mike Cox. I am one of the organizers of the Climate and Energy Forum. So welcome everybody here on the first rainy day in a long time. So for those of you who have never come to this is our third year of the Climate and Energy Forum. And the intent of these forums is really twofold. The first one is to share information and knowledge on climate change to people. But more importantly, the second part is, okay, so what? What do we do with that? What kind of actions can we take in our community, in our state, and in the country? So that's kind of the intent. The organizers of the Climate and Energy Forum are Sustainable Bainbridge, Climate Action Bainbridge, Citizens Climate Lobby, EcoDapt, and Friends of Island Power. And we were all working on climate issues, but we decided to we come together and we could do better if we're one voice. So what I'm going to do real quickly is just go over some of the things that are going on Bainbridge Island now that I think people really should be aware of or to get involved in. So let me start. Next slide. So I am a part of something called the Climate Change Advisory Committee. And this was formed by City Council about a year and a half ago to help inform and provide recommendations to the City Council. We're in the process now of creating a climate action plan for Bainbridge Island. And we're going to have community workshops, 2 of them in December, one at City Hall and the one at Bainbridge High School. And the intent of those workshops is to get your input into what you think our climate action plan should look like on Bainbridge Island. And the big goal that we've established for ourselves, and we want to hear back from you, is that we want to reduce our greenhouse gases by 90% by 2040 from 2014 levels. Many people would go, well, why don't you go carbon neutral or 100%? Well, I think the discussion today by Deerik will help us answer some of those questions of why we're not saying zero. But that's our goal. And so the plan is going to try to show us how we can get to that goal by 2040. Next slide. And so a couple projects that we've been working on. We're completing something called a greenhouse gas inventory. What the inventory does is it tries to document for the government, for the city of Bainbridge, for the community, what are our greenhouse gases and where are they coming from? We have a draft, and the draft says, you can see it here, says about a little over 50% of our greenhouse gases are from electricity. And that's not surprising, given that Puget Sound Energy, who we get our energy from, is about 60% fossil fuels. So it's not a big surprise. About 33% is transportation. That's when we drive. That's our airplanes. That's our ferries. And then there's some other stuff. So this is draft. We're going to finalize this hopefully in the next week or two. But this is what we use to try to then decide and what do we target to try to reduce our greenhouse gases. Next slide. And we've also just completed our James Ruffo Hill, I don't know if James is here, sea level rise study. And so this is in the city now. They're looking at it and seeing what their opinions are. Next slide. And just a summary, again, this is just for information. We're going to have a lot more of discussion on this at December workshops. If you look at here, this is the 50th, the central estimate for sea level rise on Bainbridge Island. They just had some updates of this. Let's just look at some dates. By 2050, we're estimating central tendency about a foot sea level rise. There's already been about 6 to 8 inches, so we're talking, a little over 1.5 feet of rise by 2050. Now that's a central estimate, and it goes all the way out to 2150. So if you go to 2100, it's over 2 feet. So what our hope is when we have these discussions, this will help in planning the future land development potentially on Bainbridge Island. And so again, this is in draft, and we're still working on it. In December forums, we'll have much more information. Next slide. City Council, what are they doing? A couple things. PSE is up for renewal. And what that means is we have a franchise agreement with PSE. The city has initiated a process to start the process to negotiate with PSE on what that franchise might look like. And it's a big deal. And so they just had this, they just announced it, and so they're going to form a committee to help advise the city on the direction to go. And as I said, over 50% of our greenhouse gases are coming from electricity. So this is going to be a big deal. Second, PSE is coming up with something called a request for information on putting community solar projects at public institutions. So, for example, the city, the parks, the schools, and the fire can all put in 5 locations where they want to have a community solar project. PSE will look across their service area and make some decisions on where they're going to fund those projects. So far, the city, I think, is going to do it. The fire department is hopeful. The parks and the schools are probably all going to apply for that. And that'll be kind of neat, have our own community solar projects. Second, green building code just last week, or this week, they had a discussion on green building. And why that's a big deal is because buildings, residential, commercial, huge suck of energy. So the green building code, again, they set up a process to start discussing how we can incorporate a green building code into Bainbridge Island. And finally, sustainable transportation. This is a plan to make our island more sustainable in transportation and walking and biking, in trails, in public transportation, kind of the whole gamut. So that's another thing they're taking up. So I'm really encouraged by the actions that the city council is taking now. Next slide. And just a couple other things. Next events for Climate and Energy Forum. January, we're trying to get Deerik Kilmer, Christina Walfus, and whoever's the mayor at the time to come and talk about the legislation that's going to be for 2020. In March, we're going to talk about food and climate, big issue. April, climate communication. We have a number of people who are experts on communicating climate change. And then we have a series called Movies That Matter. We just had one on artificial. A couple days ago, we had over 180 people at the Linwood. And this is another series that we put on the first Thursdays of each month at the public library. Next slide. And we went to Alaska Airlines and met with the sustainability director of Alaska Airlines because we're asking, where's your offset program? It takes 4 clicks to get here. So if you're trying to carbon offset on Alaska, it's hard to do. So we went and met with him. And to be honest, I'm not sure if anything's going to come from it, but it was fascinating. What he said was Alaska's aware of this. Alaska wants to be a leader, but they're still trying to figure out how to do it. And we kind of said, you know, Steve and I aren't the brightest guys in the world. Steve is, I'm not. Said, how hard could it be? You go and buy your ticket, there's a little box there, you check if you want a carbon offset. How hard can it be? He said, well, it's more complicated, of course. And Enterprise car rental. I rented a car right there. You book it, check if you want a carbon offset. It's not that complicated. But anyway, Deerik is going to tell us all about this. Next slide. So what we're going to have is 2 speakers. They're Deerik and a guy named Michael who's going to be here today to help him, but he's in Pakistan right now, so he's not going to make it. So Ted is going to talk a little bit about the Citizens Climate Lobby and current legislation on the national level, and then Deerik will be our main presenter today. So, Ted.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Okay, next slide. All right, so I'm here as a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby today. So if you haven't heard of it, Citizens Climate Lobby is a group that lobbies at the national level for climate legislation. And we meet here regularly every month on Bainbridge Island. Bobby Morgan, if you could raise your hand. She's one of the leaders of 3 leaders that organize those meetings locally. This photo here, it was taken in June in Washington, D.C. Those are volunteers from all over the country who were there to lobby members of Congress. And they do this twice a year. So this is the big one in June. Next slide, please. So as you saw, Citizens Climate Lobby is one of the sponsors of this forum. And what is Citizens Climate Lobby? It is a nationwide, in fact, international now, nonprofit, nonpartisan, grassroots advocacy organization that is focused on national policies to address climate change and in creating political will for a sustainable world, which means establishing relationships, working relationships with our legislators at the federal level. Next, please. This slide is a screenshot of a website CCL has put together for a bill that is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. So after some 8 years of effort, CCL has now this bill that is before Congress. And you can get a tremendous amount of detail on it from this website. It is an implementation of a carbon fee and dividend approach to solving climate change. And the way this would work is that fossil fuels would be assessed a fee. They call it a fee, not a tax, because the purpose of the fee is not to go into the general fund, but it goes into a dividend that is rebated back to every citizen of the U.S. And it's a steeply rising fee. We'll see a little bit of details in the, coming up here. But what I thought I would do today is to compare several bills that are before Congress. Okay, so this first one is the Energy Innovation Act. The one that I just mentioned that CCL is proposing. It has 68 sponsors now, including, that's in the House of Representatives. That includes 2 from Washington State, Deerik Kilmer, the 6th District Representative who represents Bainbridge Island, among other communities, and Denny Heck, whose District 10 is in Tacoma and Olympia. This would start, the way this works is it starts at $15 a ton of CO2 equivalent, and that translates roughly, to give you a better idea what that would actually mean, to about a 15 cents a gallon rise in the cost of gasoline, and a similar increase for electricity and other energy products, and that would flow throughout the entire economy. So prices of everything will go up. And this will increase steeply at $10 per year. So the second year will be 25, the next year 30, 35, and so on. It keeps going up. So it ratchets up the amount of money that is collected for fossil fuels, and consequently you would be getting more money yourself. But what this does is it provides incentives across the entire economy for people to make little decisions that are slightly different. On a daily basis, we all make many purchasing decisions, and by looking at little ways that you can save money with this approach, when you do that, you would also be contributing to reducing carbon dioxide emissions, because when you buy something that's cheaper, you're buying something that had less of a carbon footprint. So you'd be getting this monthly check, starts out around $20 per adult, roughly speaking, per month, and then you would have your prices would be going up that you would pay in the store about that much. But as you start to look at ways to save money, which is something we all do every day, every time we're in the store, you're actually contributing to reducing carbon dioxide and equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. So that, yeah, the destination of this is entirely in the dividend. There are several other bills before Congress. This one is called Raise Wages, Cut Carbon. It's similar, but it starts out with a much steeper initial jolt to the economy of $40 a ton, and then it goes up at a lower rate. And they, in this proposal, use the funds differently. It goes to payroll tax cuts, low-income assistance, Social Security. There'll be a little more detail on the next slide. And then there's a climate action rebate, which has been introduced in both the Senate and the House. And it's similar to the CCL proposal. It starts at $15 a ton, goes up by 15, so it rises more steeply. They do put money into a dividend, similar to the approach advocated by CCL, but they also put money into infrastructure and other things. And then there's a SWAP that stands for Stemming Warming Augmenting Pay Act, and that is starts at a higher rate, goes up more slowly, and they mostly go into payroll tax cut and general fund. Sorry. So the question is this a tax on gas? And the answer is it's actually more than that. It does affect gasoline, but it's all fossil fuels. So it's natural gas. It's every fossil fuels at the point that it enters the economy. So at the coal mine, it's at the mine, it's at the refinery, it's at the wellhead. At the point that these fuels enter the economy, this tax would be assessed. But all of the money is rebated back to us. And everyone gets the same amount of money. It doesn't matter what your usage is. So you're incentivized to reduce your carbon offset. It's also revenue neutral, and it's taxed, which means that lower income people will get more of the benefit because they're in a lower tax bracket. So in that sense, it's a progressive policy. But the point is that everyone would be incentivized to make slightly different purchasing decisions. And then consequently, there would be less fuel usage. And the economic modeling that's been done shows that this would reduce CO2 emissions by about 40% in the first 12 years, and by 90% within around 20 years or so. It's a little harder to model it that far in advance. But it gets us on track. This one policy gets us on track to what the IPCC says we need to do to stay below 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming. Yes, in the back. You make choices every time you go in the grocery store. And so this is the way, here's one way to think about this. Let's say we put a little flag on everything that you buy that tells you how much CO2 was emitted in the production of that and transportation of that product. Okay, and I give you a certain number of flags at the beginning of the month, and you can use those flags to buy products. Okay, that would work, but let's make it easier. Let's just use dollars and cents, because everyone's already running a calculator in their head every time they're in the store. So you might be in the store and you'll see something, and you know, let's say you are looking at apples, and here's an apple grown in Washington State, and here's one that was grown in New Zealand. That one that was grown in New Zealand had to be flown here, so it used a lot more carbon dioxide. It was a lot more carbon dioxide emitted in the production and transportation of it. So suddenly that price is going to be higher, and it'll go up more than the one that was grown locally. So that would be applied throughout the entire economy. So it gets everyone on board with making these choices without even realizing that they're doing it to reduce carbon offset or to reduce their carbon dioxide footprint, but simply because it's going to save them money. So the tax is assessed at the point where the fuels enter the economy. Okay, so then after that, Now the costs have gone up for these businesses. They have to decide how much of a price they're going to increase on their customers, right? But their costs have gone up, so they're going to pass along some of that cost. So eventually all of this price increases are going to end up at the consumer, right? But the consumer got the money. So the consumer, at least with this first proposal. So that means that you have a choice. And also, it's also the case that people in higher income brackets have much higher carbon footprints to begin with. They live in bigger houses, they drive bigger cars, they take European vacations, they have more things that they could reduce. And they will probably see a little bit that they will have to pay extra every month, whereas people at lower incomes already have lower carbon footprints. They live in smaller houses, don't take European vacations, and so on. People low income will all get more money every month than they are actually asked to spend. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, these do increase over time. This one is the ones that CCL is proposing. As it ratchets up, it really becomes much more noticeable. It starts at such a low amount, it's not really going to change that much behavior. But as it starts to get up to these, in the 10-year or so mark, we would expect to see a great reduction in actual usage of these fuels, and the amount of money coming in will start to go down. This is, CCL's modeling has shown that this kind of increase, they've calibrated it so that it will get us on track to meet the IPCC targets without it being a huge jolt on the economy. This proposal here, this is the CAR Act, that is actually even higher. These two probably are not increasing enough to really get us to stay below the 2 degrees C of warming that we want to stay below. Next slide, please. And I thought I would just emphasize again the differences in where the money goes. So for the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, all of the money is rebated in a dividend. For the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon tax, that's the second one, they are putting 84% of the funds collected into a payroll tax cut. 5% goes into a low-income home energy assistance program, and 10% into Social Security. So I put that into under social, and 1% to weatherization. The climate action rebate is the most similar to the CCL proposal. It puts 70% into a dividend, 20% into infrastructure, and 5% each into transition assistance and R&D. And then the SWAP, the Stemming, Warming, Augmenting Pay Act, it puts 52.5% into a payroll tax cut, 25% goes into the general fund, 7.5% to Social Security, and 15% into a carbon trust fund, which then goes to block grants to the states and things like that. So the CCL perspective here is that they feel this is the most efficient approach. If you put the money into a payroll tax cut, what are you going to do once the economy actually transitions and you're not actually collecting the money anymore? So it's a little bit more problematic, these other proposals. However, the Citizens Climate Lobby welcomes all of these proposals to the table so that we can start having discussions on the best approach. So there actually are several other proposals before Congress that were not included in this comparison that CCL had. One is a cap and trade approach, and then there are a couple of others that are actually very similar to this, but didn't quite make this comparison. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, so just to wrap up, you can, if you're interested, we do meet every month, usually the second Saturday of every month. And if you're interested in finding out more about these bills and what Citizens Climate Lobby is doing to promote them, please come to one of our meetings. So if you're interested, either talk to me or to Bobby. Raise your hand again, Bobby. Talk to either of us afterwards, and we'll be happy to give you more information. Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we do, I'd like to get to Deerik. We'll make sure we have time, but at the end, yeah, we'll have a chance for some more questions. So thanks, Ted. That was great. Couple logistics I forgot. The Eagle Harbor Congregational Church lets us use this space, which is very generous. But they do ask for a donation, so we have a donation jar over there. When you're going out, if you can put a little bit in, it helps us pay them, but also helps us defray costs for advertising and other things. So our speaker today, Deerik Broekhoff. Funny story, I remember I called Deerik. He works for the Stockholm Environment Institute, and he's been in this field for many years. So I called him, I said, Deerik, I want somebody to talk about carbon offsets. And Deerik paused. He's a very modest and humble guy. He said, pause, he said, Mike, I'm kind of an expert on this. And I go, oh, okay. we've decided, and he really is. He's been working on this for many, many years, and we're really lucky to have him. He's on the island. He has kids. He's on the Climate Change Advisory Committee, and he's very knowledgeable. So anyway, Deerik, take it away.
Thanks for the introduction. And as Michael mentioned, my colleague, Michael Gillenwater, was also going to be here today. He was unable to because of a last-minute travel change. He's on a mission in Pakistan to help build the capacity in their government to address climate change. But I mention it because what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of an advertisement, I suppose, for this guidebook that we've just developed and is about to launch in a couple days. We'll put it up on our website, a guide on using carbon offsets, and it's geared at companies and organizations, but there's a lot there that could be of interest to individuals as well. So I don't know if I put that website address in this presentation, but I can forward that information to folks if they're interested. But a lot of the ground I'm going to cover is covered in more detail in this guidebook. So next slide. So I'm going to start out not talking about carbon offsets, but talking about the fairly frightening big picture here, which is what we have before us in terms of what the world needs to do to avoid dangerous climate change. And what this graphic here is showing is what the emissions trajectories would have to look like if we are to avoid a dangerous level of global warming, 1.5 degrees Celsius. So emissions of carbon dioxide, of course, which is the main greenhouse gas associated with human-caused global warming. And these initial blue lines here are showing, what the rate of reductions would have been or could have been if we had started reducing, back in 2000, for example. Unfortunately, we're up here now. Emissions are climbing steeply. And as you may have read, there was a big report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year on avoiding, more than 1.5 degrees of warming, and basically concluding that we only have, about 10 years of emissions left at the current rate of emissions before we'll exceed this budget in terms of total amount of greenhouse or CO2 emissions emitted. And the other sobering aspect of this is that when they're talking about avoiding 1.5 degrees, they're really talking about having a greater than 66% chance of avoiding 1.5 degrees. There's a 1/3 chance that even if we stay within this budget, we're still going to see global warming in excess of that 1.5 degrees. So it's a daunting prospect. The focus on 1.5 degrees, by the way, as recently as 10 years ago, I would say, the big focus was avoiding 2 degrees of warming. And as the evidence has come in and accumulated, scientists have concluded that really we ought to be shooting for 1.5 degrees if we want to have a quote unquote safe level of warming. There was an article in today's New York Times this morning explaining how scientists' understanding of this problem has evolved over time, and what we thought would be kind of a slow progression. It's looking like global warming is happening more rapidly than we thought. So the challenge is we're here, and to stay within this budget, we'd have to reduce emissions at something like 18% per year. And again, going back to this report from last year, 18% reductions per year is not really possible. So in all the models that have been put together and how we can stay within this budget, basically they're showing we're going to overshoot that budget, and then the assumption is that in the latter half of the century, we'll implement technologies that will take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which they call negative emissions. And there are a number of technologies that can do that. None of them have been proven. The big one that is kind of incorporated in these models is called bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. So the idea is you would essentially use biomass for fuels, trees or other biomass, capture the carbon that's emitted when you burn that biomass, and then store it in geologic reservoirs in the ground. And there there are two problems with bioenergy capture, carbon capture and storage. The first is the bioenergy. The second is the carbon capture and storage, right? That neither of these things, like if you look at if you look at sort of scaling it up to the magnitude that we'd need, it's not clear how we could obtain enough fuel without significantly impacting ecosystems and world food supplies, for example. And then on the other side, it's just not demonstrated that we could store carbon in geologic reservoirs at the scale we would need. So it's a daunting picture. The bottom line is, we have to throw everything we can at this problem. And the analogy I like to use is, if you can imagine kind of a super tanker that's heading towards the harbor, it's accelerating, it's already too close to stop, it's gonna hit. But that doesn't mean it's hopeless, right? We can still kind of throw everything into reverse, try to steer the super tanker so that it minimizes the damage. And that's how I see the task before us right now. And that's where carbon offsets come in. So we have a really urgent problem. You may have heard about carbon offsets. You may have heard some skeptical things about them. And to some degree, the concerns about carbon offsets are justified. But I would argue that in this context where we kind of need to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the problem, they still have a role to play. And that's what I'll talk about. So next slide. So what is a carbon offset? It's, in essence, conceptually, it's a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or an increase in carbon storage. So, trees take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere when they grow. So if you promote more tree growth, you can increase the storage in the trees and not in the atmosphere. So a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions or an increase in carbon storage that's used to compensate for emissions that occur somewhere else. So you can't maybe reduce your own carbon footprint, but you can pay someone else to reduce emissions for you and count that towards your own greenhouse gas reduction goal. That's the basic idea. And this idea has been implemented, if you will, in the form of what people commonly call carbon credits or offset credits, which is a kind of transferable instrument certified by a government or a nonprofit organization to represent an emission reduction of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent, right? CO2 is the main greenhouse gas, but there are a number of other greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming. If you reduce those, you can count those reductions as well. So when you purchase a carbon credit, you're basically buying a claim to this emission reduction that's been achieved somewhere else. And you can retire that credit in order to claim it against your own greenhouse gas reduction goals. So if you're trying to become carbon neutral, that can be counted towards offsetting your greenhouse gas carbon footprint. Next slide. So in most cases, carbon offsets come from discrete projects. So you may hear this term, carbon offset project. Projects can involve a wide range of activities that reduce emissions or increase carbon storage, ranging from renewable energy or energy efficiency projects, including, a popular category is clean cook stoves in developing countries. Destruction or avoidance of methane is another big category, and methane is generated from a number of different human activities. So you can capture it, destroy it, that avoids the emissions. That could be an offset. There are industrial gas destruction projects. So a number of industrial processes produce greenhouse gases that are really potent. They have many times the impact on global warming of a single molecule of CO2. So mitigating these activities, essentially capturing these waste gases and destroying them, can also be an offset. And then, of course, a lot of people hear about forestry and carbon offsets. So planting trees or avoiding deforestation. It's another big category, but it's not the biggest one. And I think a lot of times you hear about carbon offsets and people think of forestry and some of the problems or challenges associated with forestry as an offset. There are challenges, but there are many other kinds of activities. And if you look at sort of the global market for carbon offsets, the largest number of credits that have been issued are really for other kinds of projects, including industrial gases and methane emissions and things like that. The other thing about carbon offset projects is they don't, in many cases, just reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They can have multiple benefits. And those can range, depends on the project type, but they can include employment opportunities, enhanced air and water quality, so other kinds of environmental benefits, improved energy access in poorer countries, so on and so forth. So that's another selling point for carbon offsets. And another reason why a lot of people focus on forestry, for example, because forest conservation is an urgent problem in the world, and so carbon offset can help address these other issues in addition to helping to mitigate climate change. Carbon offset programs. So what is a carbon offset program? These are basically standard-setting bodies, standard-setting organizations that have been established to provide quality assurance. So early on, there was kind of this Wild West situation in the carbon offset market. No real standards around how you quantify the emission reductions and certify these carbon offsets, and people were selling all kinds of things. And so the big challenge here is when you're trying to ascertain whether you're buying a good carbon offset credit, it's a hard thing to do, like ascertaining the quality of these things. So these programs were set up to provide some quality assurance. And they range from international governmental bodies. The largest carbon offset program in the world was actually established under the Kyoto Protocol, called the Clean Development Mechanism. So there's this United Nations body that basically certified these projects in developing countries. And the idea was that the industrialized countries could invest in these projects in developing countries, which themselves didn't have any emission reduction commitments otherwise. But the industrialized countries could count those emission reductions towards their obligations under the Kyoto Protocol. So that program actually resulted in several billion tons worth of CO2 equivalent emission reductions, but not without its own problems, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you also have, in parallel to this Kyoto Protocol market, starting about, just getting close to 15 years ago, there was an upsurge in voluntary interest in carbon offsets. So you've had a number of these programs that have been established around the world that certify carbon offsets for the voluntary market, for companies and individuals. And so most of these logos here are for organizations that were established to serve the voluntary market. This is the UN Clean Development Mechanism logo. All these others are voluntary programs. Gold Standard and Vera are essentially international, operating in just about every country. Climate Action Reserve, where I used to be the policy director, that operates in California, and it's focused in the United States. Same with ACR. Plan Vivo is also international, but primarily engaged in projects in Mexico. So these programs have three basic functions. One is they set standards for how you quantify these reductions and how you determine whether a project should be eligible or not to be issued carbon credits. And I'll get to some, later on I'll get into what some of these basic criteria are. Then they review these projects against standards, and that's usually with the assistance of what they call independent verification bodies or verifiers. So there are these organizations that perform professional verification services in a number of industries, but they're heavily involved in the carbon offset market as well. So they will go out and review these projects, make sure they meet the standards and criteria and sign off on that, and then the programs will take the reports from these verifiers and decide whether to approve a project and issue credits to it. And then third, these programs operate registry systems. And so this is where the double counting question comes in. So they issue these credits, they give them a unique serial number or identifier, and then they track the transfer and retirement of these credits in the registry systems. So that way they ensure that these project developers aren't selling the same reduction to multiple parties, double counting essentially, or double using the emission reductions. And then they make sure that when it's retired, there's a clear indication of the purpose for that retirement. So whoever owned the credit can't say, oh yeah, I'm retiring this on your behalf and I'm retiring it on your behalf too, and so on and so forth. So the programs really try to police this stuff and make sure that there's a robust claim that you can make when you retire a credit. Yeah. So what does it mean to retire a credit? What are we talking about here with the transfer and then retirement? Yeah, excellent question. So the idea is a project, let's say it's a landfill methane capture and destruction project. It will start operation, it will reduce emissions. The program will issue credits once that project has reduced a certain number of emissions equivalent to the CO2 equivalent for those methane reductions. So say it reduced 100 tons worth of emissions, the program will issue 100 credits. That goes into an account that's owned by the project developer. So now the project developer has these credits. They can sell those credits to someone who wants to use them towards an emission reduction target of some sort. So they'll find a buyer for those credits. The buyer will then take ownership of the credit, so it gets transferred to them. And then to actually use it, in order to be able to count it towards your reduction obligation, or to count it towards your own carbon footprint, you have to retire that credit. That means basically you take it out of circulation. So once you retire it, you can't give it to anybody else. Nobody else can use that credit. It's used at that point. So that's what retirement means. There can be a number of intermediaries before the final retirement of the credit. So the airline buys it from the project developer, then a customer will sign up to offset the emissions from their flight, and then the airline will essentially retire those credits on behalf of the customer. Yeah, so that question is, are there any controls on the pricing that for carbon offsets? The short answer is no. So it's a market-based system. The project developers will sell credits for whatever they can get in the market. And intermediaries like the airlines can raise the price, so when they'll buy the credits on a wholesale basis and then they'll sell them at a retail price to their customers and make a profit on that sale. And the idea is that this market essentially enables these projects to happen, right? So landfill methane destruction, to use that example again, in some cases landfills are required by law to implement these mitigation projects. In which case, you paying them money to reduce the emissions doesn't really do anything. And I'll get to that issue in a little bit here. But in the absence of that requirement, right, there's no real reason to capture methane emissions and destroy them. So the idea is you pay the landfill to do that. That produces emission reductions that would not have happened anyway. And that's an actual emission reduction that you can count towards your own carbon footprint, because you paying for that credit basically enabled that project to happen. That's the basic concept. So a final note here, the programs themselves do not sell carbon credits. They certify these credits. So they certify the projects, they issue the credits, and they run these tracking systems. But they're not involved in the market itself. And that's an important distinction. So you will occasionally come across organizations that try to do both of these things. They will say they certified the carbon credits and they'll also offer the credits for sale. And that's a big warning flag, I would say, because it's a conflict of interest. And so all these programs have basically, the ones listed here, at least have steadfastly kept themselves out of the market and let other folks deal with the market side of things. So that's another element here, why they don't regulate the prices. They basically let the market function for itself, but they provide the infrastructure for this market to operate. Next slide. Chances are you've heard some skepticism about carbon offsets. And everything I've said till now, it's like, well, what's the problem? These sound great. Well, criticisms generally fall into two categories. So one is basically how the offsets are used and the kind of perverse incentives that can come along with the use of carbon offsets to reduce emissions. So here I've kind of paraphrased what some common criticisms are. They allow polluters to go on polluting and can lock in pollution. So just as an example, if you have to replace your water heater and you're shopping for like a super efficient heat pump model or a more standard model that's not very efficient. And the heat pump model is going to reduce emissions. It uses less electricity, and that's going to reduce emissions on the electrical grid from power plants. But you look at sort of the cost of going up to that super efficient model and the cost of the standard model, and you decide, you know what, offsets are really cheap. I'll just get the cheap model and I'll offset the rest of the emissions. That would be a mistake, right? And especially writ large, if everybody were to take that approach, we'd be in big trouble, because basically once you get that new water heater in, it's going to be there for what, 10, 15 years? Or if it's a power plant, you're talking 50 years. So you can justify putting in high carbon emitting infrastructure in various forms. It's going to be there for a long time. And going back to that first slide, given the urgency of reducing emissions across the board, we can't afford today to be putting in high carbon infrastructure. So if you're using carbon offsets to justify not making the investment in high energy efficiency, clean energy kinds of products and infrastructure, that's a mistake. And people have recognized that, and that's I would say, a valid criticism. Another one is carbon offsets create this incentive to not regulate carbon emissions, right? So the idea, like I used this example before, like some landfills are just required to reduce emissions. That's the case in California. Every landfill there basically has to install methane capture and destruction equipment. And so, and that, in a lot of ways is the most efficient way to address these emissions. But if you have a situation where landfill owners are already being paid, they're like, hey, this is great, we'll install this equipment, people are willing to pay us for these carbon credits, we make a profit, they're not going to want to see that market opportunity go away. And so if you then come in and say, well, you know what, we want to regulate you guys, they're going to push back. And this is true, again, across the board. So there's this question, that was a big issue under the Kyoto Protocol. It's like, okay, this is great, industrialized countries can help developing countries reduce their emissions, but then these developing countries are not going to want to implement regulations themselves, and they actually came up with a whole convoluted set of rules. This is kind of a digression here, but convoluted set of rules saying, well, okay, if a developing country implements a law after we've set up this carbon offset program, we're going to ignore that law. So even though these reductions would happen anyway because they're required, we're going to treat them as if they're not required by law, because we want to avoid this perverse incentive. We want to encourage these countries to implement these regulations. And so it sets up this kind of weird dynamic that you want to avoid. And so that's, the bottom line is carbon offsets are not a long-term solution. They can be an interim kind of approach, encouraging people to accelerate emission reductions in the near term. But because of these issues, the lock-in issue and the perverse incentives, you want to be cautious about just blindly investing in carbon offsets. So that's one set of criticisms. The other is, maybe the one that gets a bit more attention, which is what I'd call carbon offset quality, concerns about the quality. So, arguments that these carbon credits don't really represent valid greenhouse gas mitigation. And if they're used to substitute for real climate action, they only make climate change worse, right? So let's take the example, again, the landfill required by law to reduce their emissions. If you pay that landowner, the landfill owner, to reduce emissions, you're not really causing any change in the world. They were going to reduce those emissions anyway. And if you then take a carbon credit issued for these, what are called non-additional reductions, and you claim that towards your emission reduction goal, trying to get to zero carbon footprint or something like that. So you're not reducing your emissions. Whereas if you hadn't bought that carbon credit, you would have found some other way to reduce your own emissions. Then you're actually making the problem worse, right? Because nothing changes at the landfill, but your emissions are higher than they would have otherwise been. And that's a real problem. So if you're buying, carbon credits associated with greenhouse gas emission reductions that are not additional, they would have happened regardless of you, making this purchase, making this payment for the reductions, then you're not improving the climate, you're making it worse. There have actually been studies, some of my colleagues at the Stockholm Environment Institute were involved in this study a few years ago looking at the clean development mechanism in particular under the Kyoto Protocol, and determined that up to 70% of the credits certified under that program are associated with reductions that it's not clear that they're additional. And that's a big number, right? So, and mainly because a lot of the credits were issued for wind energy projects, for example, especially in China, where the economics were already favorable to wind, where China had already set out this national goal. It wasn't legally required, but they said, hey, we're going to increase renewable energy generation by X% as an aspiration. And so it was really questionable whether these projects were additional. And so that's where a lot of this concern comes in. And you can always find unscrupulous project developers who will argue that their project is additional, even if it's not. And so that's the challenge that the programs, the regulators are up against, is how do you sort this stuff out? And then the other quality concern is that these projects can have adverse impacts, not related to climate change. So maybe they're reducing emissions, but you're displacing local communities, with a hydroelectric dam or something like that, and can make other environmental problems worse. So, if you're subsidizing coal mines or big concentrated feedlot, livestock operations or something like that, that can create other problems, even though you may be validly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's been another big concern with these markets. So, it's not, I wouldn't say these are fatal problems, but they're definitely concerns. They definitely raise flags. Sometimes the criticisms are a bit overblown. They'll argue it's buying carbon offsets is like buying medieval indulgences or something like that. And there's parallels. I can see that. I'll get to that in a minute. But you do have to be aware of what concerns are really valid. And so that's the challenge. There's these markets out there. There's these certification programs. But if you want to buy offsets, my recommendation would be to do some homework. And so I'll talk a bit about that. So next slide. So carbon offset quality. I've already talked a little bit about this, but the central idea behind a carbon offset is that it can substitute for a greenhouse gas emission reduction that you would have made on your own. Right? That's the kind of motivating concept here. So, rather than reduce my own emissions, because I find it too hard to do so, too expensive, I'm going to pay someone else to reduce emissions for me, and that's going to, it's going to have the equivalent effect on the world, on the atmosphere. And in theory, that's a fine idea, because if you look at greenhouse gas emissions, it's not a localized problem. Carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas mixes pretty quickly and rapidly throughout the atmosphere. So it really doesn't matter in principle where you reduce emissions. It's how much you reduce them. So whether you reduce a ton of carbon dioxide here in the United States or down in South America, as far as global warming is concerned, not a big difference. So conceptually, it's an okay idea. But for this to work, the world has to be at least as well off when you use a carbon credit as it would have been if you'd reduced your own carbon footprint. And so how do you ensure that that's the case? So there's a number of criteria that have been developed around that. I'll get to that in the next slide. But the quality of a carbon credit refers to the level of confidence that this will be true. It's not, it can never be determined with absolute certainty, right? Because you're dealing with a counterfactual situation, something that would have happened in this alternative universe, basically. And so that's the big challenge with carbon offsets and carbon offset quality is how do you know? How can you determine whether this is something that would have happened anyway or it was really induced by the willingness of me or others to pay for these carbon credits? And another common term you'll hear is, a high quality offset is said to have environmental integrity. So if you have a high level of confidence that the world is at least as well off when I purchased this carbon credit as it would have been if I'd reduced my own emissions, that's said to preserve environmental integrity. Next slide. Don't carbon offset programs do this? Isn't that what they're designed to do? Don't they ensure quality? Short answer is yes. That's what they're intended to do. But at the end of the problem here is at the end of the day, they have a binary decision to make, right? It's either issue a credit or don't issue a credit. But this isn't a binary question when you're talking about quality, it's level of confidence. So, just conceptually, this isn't what programs actually do. They don't score things on a scale of 1 to 100. But imagine that essentially, they're assigning a score and they're going to say, we're going to issue a credit for every emission reduction that scores above 50 in terms of the level of confidence that this is a good carbon offset. In effect, that's what they do. So anything above 50, it's going to get a credit. Anything below that, it's not eligible. But when you buy a credit, it's a score of 51 really good enough? Is that enough confidence for you? So it's a buyer. Maybe it's okay. I mean, you could say, well, yeah, fine. As long as the program issues it, I'm going to buy it. But if you really want to have a strong impact, you may want something that scores a bit higher than that. And so the question is, how do you know what quality of credit you're getting? And this is why the program certification generally isn't enough. And in fact, as I'm going back to this study we did of the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism, if 70% of the credits can be questioned, then evidence to date is that some of these big programs are issuing credits for things that are much below 50, well below 50 in terms of the level of confidence. So it's something for buyers to be aware of, and it pays to be selective in the kinds of carbon offsets that you're buying. And so the question is, what can you as a buyer do? Next slide. So yeah, before I get into those strategies, let me talk a little bit more about the quality. And so what are these criteria? The big one that sort of trumps everything else is it additional, right? We've already talked about this a bit. Is the carbon offset payment really enabling this project to happen such that it would not have happened if there were no carbon offset market? And it sounds easy enough as a concept, but it's really hard in a lot of cases to make that determination for individual projects. In some cases, it's relatively easy. So industrial gas destruction projects, kind of like what's pictured here, right? In a lot of cases, you're talking about waste gases that just go into the atmosphere. There's no legal requirement to capture them or avoid those emissions. And there's no other revenue stream for destroying these emissions. So when there's no other incentive to engage in this activity, it's a pretty strong indication that the carbon credits are really what's driving that activity. So there are projects like that. But there's a lot of others. Question?
It seems like you can't, you're giving a talk just on offsets, and I understand that, but it seems it's this larger issue of we don't want offsets to be the first go-to. We want them to be valued less than retrofitting, than fixing the problem. And so we need to somehow, economically have incentives for those green industries and for those retrofits, and to not have offsets be the only value out there. And you were just giving that example of there's no other alternative. That would be, that's because we're not going to get there if everything goes to offsets.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I'm getting to that.
Okay.
So yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're anticipating where I'm headed here. So, this is kind of an aside, but these industrial gas destruction projects make good carbon offsets. And they're cheap. It's not expensive to install these equipment. Now, one of the problems that happened under the Kyoto Protocol was, the market price was being set by these activities that were much more expensive. And so, credits were selling for $10, $15 per ton or something like that. Whereas you go to these HFC plants in China, that were producing, it's called HFC 23, you install this equipment to destroy those emissions, and it costs maybe less than $1 per ton. And so they were reaping huge surplus profits on these projects because they could sell the credits for $10 or $15 per ton. Now, that's great, that's the way markets are supposed to work, but just from a global social welfare perspective, it would have been far cheaper just to require them to install that equipment. Take that off the table and free up that profit to invest in other things that are more expensive and maybe higher priority as well. So yeah, there's all kinds of questions around there. But and there were other issues with the HFC 23 projects. But anyway, but this is the big one, right? And when you're talking about some of the co-benefits, like the multiple benefits I talked about earlier with forestry projects, like preserving ecosystems and things like that. Those are all great things, but if a project is not additional, those things are going to happen anyway too. So you're not getting any benefits if you're investing in projects that, for whatever reason, were going to happen without that payment for the carbon credits. Another key criterion, they're not overestimated, right? So the other question is, all right, my project's additional. You may determine that the project's additional, but then the question is, well, what would greenhouse gas emissions have been in the absence of this project? It's another counterfactual question. So there's a number of issues that go into overestimation. So what would the baseline emissions have been? That's the big question. But there's other issues here as well. So you may have, if you're familiar with carbon offsets at all, you may have heard this term leakage. Right? So a project can reduce emissions in one location, but maybe it causes them to go up somewhere else. And if you're not accounting for that increase, then you're going to overestimate the number of emission reductions. And the classic example there is, if you're doing forest conservation, you may protect one parcel of land, but the logging that would have occurred there just gets displaced somewhere else. They cut down some other forests. So the net benefit is, close to zero in that case. So that's another big sort of methodological challenge that these programs have to try to deal with, is how do we accurately estimate or really conservatively estimate what the emission reductions are. The aim is to err on the side of undercounting rather than overcounting, but there still can be a fair amount of uncertainty there. CO2 emissions, if you emit a ton of CO2, that's going to elevate atmospheric concentrations of CO2 for a very long time. So there's kind of a decay curve associated with CO2 in the atmosphere, that 1 ton after about 100 years, you have elevated concentrations of maybe a quarter of a ton or something like that. But that quarter of a ton stays there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, right? So if you're going to compensate for that emission, you've got to have a reduction that's similarly permanent. And that's the big challenge with things like forestry that basically take the carbon out of the atmosphere, but then it's in trees, ecosystems that are susceptible to being disturbed, whether it's fire or disease or human activity that can release that carbon back to the atmosphere. And if that happens, you don't have an offset anymore. Now the programs have these kinds of insurance mechanisms in place to try to insure against fire and disease and natural disturbances and things like that. They put obligations on the landowners, so they face a penalty, have to compensate for the losses if they log that land in the future. But even the best insurance programs can't insure against this risk in perpetuity for thousands of years. And so that's basically a trade-off that you have to be aware of if you're buying forestry-based offsets. They can have all kinds of great other kinds of benefits, forest conservation globally is absolutely essential if we're going to avoid 1.5 degrees of global warming, more than that, because deforestation is a big contributor to human emissions. But if you're talking about substituting forestry mitigation for fossil fuel-based emissions, there's some risks there, and so that's something to be aware of. Not double counted. This issue was raised earlier. How many people are claiming the reductions? When you buy that offset credit, you retire it against your carbon footprint. You want to make sure that's an exclusive claim. If somebody else has, if that emission reduction is occurring at a power plant, this can be a problem with wind energy, for example, right? The wind turbine itself doesn't have any emissions. The way it reduces emissions is it displaces electricity generation on the power grid from a fossil fuel power plant, natural gas or coal or something like that. Well, if that power plant, that fossil fuel power plant, has an obligation to reduce emissions, they're going to be counting that reduction towards that obligation. So like California has this cap and trade program. It covers all that power sector. If you're buying wind energy in California, you may reduce emissions, but you're basically freeing up that power plant, another power plant somewhere to emit more because it's going to rise to the level of the cap. Things like that. And then, there's another issue I'll get to later, which is under the Paris Agreement, every country in the world has essentially pledged to reduce emissions. So, if you take them at their word, which for every country, maybe except for this one, you can kind of take them at their word. Those reductions are going to happen anyway, and the countries are going to claim those reductions. And so there's some double counting issues there that need to be resolved. And I mentioned earlier, programs at least have some mechanisms in place with their registry systems to prevent the most egregious forms of double counting, but there's still different kind of more subtle ways that it can happen. And then finally, not harming anyone, right? So again, you may have a project that reduces emissions, and it's good for the climate, and it's additional and all the rest. But if you are causing other kinds of environmental or social harms, that's not a good offset. And that's a picture of the Three Gorges Dam there in China, which you may have heard has had some adverse impacts. It's not a carbon offset project to my knowledge, but similar kinds of projects around the world, not quite as large scale as this, have faced a lot of criticism for displacing indigenous communities, so on and so forth. So that's another key criterion. Here, what can you do as a buyer? Now, this guidebook that I talked about, on which this presentation is based, we go into some really detailed questions that you can ask about projects to try to dive into the specifics of carbon offset projects, get a better idea for the quality. I'm not going to go into those here, but here's some quick kinds of rules of thumb you can use as an individual. The first, of course, is vetting the project. So, taking a look at what are these projects that you're actually buying carbon offset credits from. So just getting a better sense. A lot of retailers will at least provide some information and some stories about these projects. They, of course, have an incentive to present them in the best light. But, at least, knowing what it is that you're buying from, as opposed to just clicking a button on the airline's website, is at least a good first step. Probably the easiest, most effective thing to do is to stick to lower risk project types. So not all projects are alike. On balance, go for those that don't have other revenue streams like renewable energy, energy efficiency. Those are good things. They're not necessarily good offsets. So industrial gas destruction, for example. Things that are easily quantified, emission reductions that are permanent. Then we get to the strategy that you mentioned, buying more than you need. That's one way you can go. So one way to address uncertainties or your lower level of confidence, perhaps, is to overbuy the credits. Buy 2 credits for every ton that you want to offset. That can help to address quality concerns, although it's not effective if all you're buying is non-additional tons, right? You buy 2 non-additional tons, it's the same as buying 1. So you at least want to check the other quality criteria as well. And then some people talk about, well, is price a good indicator for offset quality? Short answer is no. Some of the good offset types can be quite cheap. Some of the more expensive ones may not be additional or good quality. So there's some correlation there, but it's not a reliable indicator. And then vintage, right? So some people are concerned about buying older credits that were issued a long time ago. That sometimes is an indicator. If there's a project developer that they didn't secure buyers up front, they've been sitting on these credits for 10 years after the project began implementation. They haven't sold them. That's a pretty strong indication they didn't need the credits to get the project going. And so that could be a concern. But just because a credit is newer does not mean it's better necessarily. So that's a tricky one to use. One conundrum here is there can be a trade-off. So one of the reasons you might want to invest in offsets is for the multiple benefits you get. Not just greenhouse gas emission reductions, but the other environmental and social benefits. One dilemma here, and this is a really busy slide, sorry, it's from a study I did a few years ago, but the issue is you have, here this is like scale of potential sustainable development benefits. So these projects up here all have good sustainable development benefits, and there's a big group of different kinds of projects here that have great benefits, but low confidence in terms of their environmental integrity. And so, it's a trade-off there. Whereas, some of these kinds of projects can be really high confidence in terms of the carbon offset value, but they don't really do much in terms of other social and environmental benefits. So just to be aware, you kind of, one strategy is to kind of put together a portfolio, like buy offsets from a number of different kinds of projects, high confidence offsets, but then some that also have these other benefits, even though you may have lower confidence about their offset value. So how to use carbon offsets? So that, this idea of carbon neutrality has gained a lot of traction lately. There's a lot of focus on this. We want to reduce, get to net zero emissions. In some cases by the mid-century, but in some cases like right now today. Your carbon offsets are a primary tool for achieving carbon neutrality, right? The idea is you have a certain amount of emissions, maybe you reduce what you can, and then you buy offsets to cover the rest and get to claim that you have zero, as a carbon footprint of zero. Now the problem with this is that it can be really tempting, just given how cheap carbon offsets are, to rely on carbon offsets as a primary means for meeting this goal. And if you do that, you're essentially doing it wrong. Although it can sound ambitious, carbon neutrality you can mask what is ultimately required to avert climate change. It goes back to this lock-in issue that you don't want to buy the cheap water heater and offset the emissions. You want to get that high energy efficiency water heater, and then after that, offset what you really can't eliminate. So relying heavily on offsets is a mistake. So the rules, reduce your own emissions first. Just because it's cheaper to buy offsets, that's not an excuse for buying offsets. Offset only what you truly cannot eliminate. And I put this back up here just to say, given the urgency of the situation, you can't really justify not doing everything you can to reduce your own emissions. As an individual, as an organization, as a country, we need to focus on internal mitigation. So this guy, I was mentioning this earlier. So 2015 Paris Agreement, every country in the world has pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the big issues, there's a part of the Paris Agreement that sets up this, it recognizes the potential for international cooperation so that some countries can invest in mitigation in other countries and then claim those reductions for themselves. It's the same idea, carbon offsets. But the big question there that's ongoing in the international negotiations here is how to avoid double counting. You don't want a country to claim an emission reduction in another country and then that other country also claims that same emission reduction. It becomes a hall of mirrors at that point. And so that sounds like it ought to be non-controversial and straightforward, but it's actually the subject of some intense negotiations. And it's there's the next UN conference coming up in December in what will now be Madrid instead of Santiago. That's going to be a big part of the negotiations there. But this is an issue for voluntary carbon offsets as well, right? So if you're buying an offset that takes place in Namibia, let's say, right? And Namibia has this emission reduction goal, and you're reducing emissions, from sources that are covered by that goal. Namibia is going to count that reduction, right? So you can't really, the presumption ought to be Namibia is going to do that anyway, so you can't really count that as an offset. Now, one option is for Namibia to say, oh, you bought that, okay, well, fine, you take it, we won't count that towards our emission reduction goal. But a lot of countries are not going to be very willing to do that, especially developing countries. There's been a longstanding issue of what they call carbon colonialism. The rich countries coming in and sort of buying up their cheap reductions. And so they're not going to readily just give that up. And so the question is, what does that mean, right? If you got the whole world taking action on climate change, which is what we want, that's great, but then there may not be much opportunity for actually offsetting your own emissions. And one option that's on the table that's being discussed in the voluntary carbon offset community is to really redefine what it is we're talking about. So not to achieve carbon neutrality and offset your emissions, but think of these credits as a voluntary contribution towards other countries or even this country's greenhouse gas reduction goals. And that, I think is still a compelling idea, but people have been thinking for so long about offsets and carbon neutrality that it's a real paradigm shift that they're struggling to kind of adjust to. And so that's, in parallel to these negotiations, there's this big discussion going on in the voluntary offset community. What do we do here? Climate change is urgent. Carbon offsets can be one tool if used responsibly to help accelerate action on climate change. So I wouldn't say don't ever invest in these things. You reduce your own emissions, but if you buy carbon offset credits, you can have a real impact on the world. And just given the lack of progress so far, again, we need to throw everything in the kitchen sink at this. So carbon offsets are one way to do that. Carbon neutrality is a great goal, but not if you just offset all your emissions. You need to focus on reducing your own footprint. And then finally, I would encourage people to embrace this idea. Like maybe carbon neutrality isn't the sine qua non here. Maybe look at carbon credits as a way to just accelerate global action, contribute to the ability of countries to meet their emission reduction pledges. And that's it. Sorry, there's like 5 minutes left for questions. But.
No, I think we usually go to 12. People can leave if they want, but if you guys are willing to take questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
I thought that point that you just made at the end was a really important one, because it seems like part of the offset benefit is getting money, I don't know if it's better this way, is getting money to invest in projects that reduce carbon emissions, whether it's you call it offset or not. And so if you actually called the program Carbon Reduction Investor, it would change the orientation. And I'm curious how closely people have looked at that, and if that changes the evaluation criteria, and if you can build a program around that where projects would be seen from that standpoint. Is this a good project to put money into that needs money, and can we get people to invest in that, and how that changes the approach?
Yeah, excellent question. Short answer is yes. People have been looking at that. The big carbon offset programs I talked about, like Gold Standard and Vera, they've actually had these ongoing consultations for several years now, anticipating the Paris Agreement and saying, hey, what can we do here? How about defining this different kind of credit? Unfortunately, there were a lot of good ideas thrown out there, but they kind of ran this up the flagpole and realized like the market out there hasn't quite adjusted to this reality yet. And so they're kind of hemming and hawing, and it's, I don't know, we'll see how things shake out. But thinking of carbon credits that way does, I think, allow you to relax a little bit the requirements. I would say it's still, you still don't want to pay for something that's non-additional, right? If it's going to happen anyway, that's just a waste of money. So you still need to have these criteria. Maybe permanence doesn't matter as much. You invest in forestry projects, and that's a good thing. Yes, people are thinking about it, but I think we still have a little ways to go.
This is maybe more for Mike. Goes back to one of the first slides you showed of the pie chart of greenhouse gas emissions for Bainbridge Island, the sources of them. And of course, those are direct emissions. But then we're also, as individuals, responsible for all the products we buy, the embedded greenhouse gas emissions. Do you have any rough idea of how they compare, the indirect versus the direct?
Deerik can answer that one.
All right.
No, it's consumption-based.
Yeah, that's right.
So could you make that quick distinction?
Yeah. So the inventory that Mike alluded to, he put up that one graph, but there's another chapter in there on consumption-based emissions, which is the embedded emissions that you're referring to. So they're emissions that don't occur here on the island, but they're emitted in the production of the goods and services that we consume here. And I'd have to go back and look, but typically, that footprint is half again as big as the direct carbon footprint for a community in the.
But to make the real change that we need in the time period we have, demand has to increase substantially for these offsets. And the only way I think to do that is you've got to put a requirement on industry to buy offsets for some percentage, or like 100%, and you ratchet that up over a very short period of time. How does this match in with legislative ideas or other, much like we just heard about, from CCL. There's a kind of a Republican sort of organization, CLC, that hopefully you get some co-sponsorship with. But what kind of legislative efforts are underway to force demand for credits, through the legislative process?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I had, rule number 1 up there is reduce your own emissions. Really it ought to be, advocate as strongly as you can for policy change, right? Climate change is a collective action problem. It's not a problem of individual virtue or something like that. So, all the voluntary action in the world is not, unfortunately, going to solve this problem. We need strong policy requirements. And hopefully we get there with the Paris Agreement and all that. Again, in this country, the situation's complicated. The carbon offsets were originally conceived as a kind of regulatory instrument, not primarily for the voluntary market. So under Kyoto, that was a international regulatory program in the various, carbon offsets are a component of California's cap and trade program. There's another cap and trade program in the northeastern United States, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, that also incorporates carbon offsets. And you can also combine them with a carbon tax. Mexico and South Africa have carbon taxes, but they allow companies to meet their tax obligation through buying carbon offsets as well. Now, it's tricky because all these same problems still apply to those programs, and so there's a big debate around how much do you want to allow companies to just buy offsets as opposed to reducing their own emissions. Yeah.
I have one of the things I took away from your talk is how complicated it can be to actually evaluate the offsets. And I'm going to ask a question that's going to complicate it further. One of the things that I took away from the Al Gore sequel movie was how India was sort of a standout, or a holdout on the climate accords. Mm-hmm. And at one point, the spokesperson there said, "Energy is a human right," and that just really has stuck with me. So my question is, in addition to offsetting, would your offset create the additional benefit? What about a potential future benefit? Like, what about a project that brings energy into a community that desperately needs it? Mm-hmm. So you might be offsetting, I don't know, some coal burning or something to heat a house, but you might also be providing additional energy that is needed for development of that community. Is that being talked about? Is there a way to include that in the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I would say one type of offset that is growing in popularity are these programs, they're called clean cook stoves, essentially. So programs to basically provide poorer families in developing countries with more efficient cook stoves, so they burn charcoal more efficiently. It reduces pollution indoors. It actually produces more energy output, so it's like a win-win. The one challenge, try not to take too long here, but the assumption there's an assumption built into the accounting for these projects that these households would have turned to fossil fuels at some point. And so they're basically counting the reductions against this imagined baseline of using more fossil fuels. And some people criticize that because right now they're not. And are you overcounting the reductions? But in essence, yeah, you're meeting those energy demands with these projects and producing health benefits and everything else. So it's an attractive category. And there's some other kinds of projects along those lines, like solar panels, rural household solar panels and things like that. Again, there's this trade-off between the sort of robustness of that carbon offset claim versus the benefits you're providing those communities. But given those other benefits, I think it's an attractive category.
Got a couple more questions, and then we have one more thing we want to get to before we go. So somebody who hasn't asked a question.
Yes, I wondered if you have any comment on Canada's carbon dividend program.
I don't know enough.
Okay,
Yeah,
I just
sorry.
heard that I was listening to a podcast, and they have a program, and then they were going to give dividends, British Columbia. It said all of Canada though.
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
maybe it's piloted in British Columbia.
Canada's
But anyway,
doing so many things, it's hard for me to keep track. But
on the income tax, they would check. Do you want your dividend back or not?
Yeah, what's happening in Canada is national. It went into effect just a few months ago, and it's very similar to the CCL proposal. So there is some pushback in some provinces that are trying to fight against it, but the recent Canadian elections polls showed that majority of Canadians are in support, and the politics is really shifting in Canada. Of course, Canadians are much more aware of the changes that are occurring in the Arctic, which is changing environmentally much faster than most of the rest of the world because of warming, so they're much more aware of it. But we hope to follow a similar process here.
Okay, let's do one more, and then I assume Ted and Deerik, you can stay over a little bit if there are questions. Okay. Anybody else have one final question they want to go? If not, Steve?
The kind of social benefit of people having to confront the carbon offset. So now, I think when I bought a ticket that had a carbon offset yes, no on it, all of a sudden I started thinking more about flight shaming and the impact of flying. So is there other ways that can be useful? So, the New Zealand apple, a lot of people aren't don't know the difference, but is it a way when you actually had to pay that, or you had to decline it, or something? Or is there some benefit there, and how does that work? Some social benefit.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and that starts to get into like marketing psychology and stuff that I'm not an expert on. I would say there's a kind of raging debate there, right? So there are people in the flight shaming movement who are like, carbon offsets are evil because people just buy these plane tickets anyway and then relieve themselves of any guilt because they bought the carbon offsets, and what you really want people is to not fly as much. But on the other hand, it could be just like you say, like, oh yeah, when I fly in an airplane, it's going to emit carbon dioxide emissions. So maybe I should think about this in the future. I don't know the answer, like what the balance is there.
Okay. Well, thank you, Deerik and Ted, very much. So before you leave, we want to finish on what you can do. And so, Erica and Jane, if you want to come up and tell us what can we do here on Bainbridge Island.
Yeah, I'm Erica Schreiner, and I've been active with several environmental organizations that really focus on climate in our community. One thing we've noticed from having these forums is that people get real motivated, and most of them walk out thinking, I'm going to do something. And I think most of the people in this room really want to do something, or you wouldn't be here today. So we've invented or created something that allows you to do things much easier. It allows you to be right where decisions on climate are being made. That may be at the local level, it may be at the state level, or even at the national level. We want to make it easy for you. So we've invented something called Act for Climate. And the 4 has to do with the fact that we're asking you to take a pledge. And we're serious about it, and we hope you are. To really put your name down and say, I pledge that in the next 12 months, I will show up 4 times where it really counts for climate. Now, once you sign up, you'll be notified about an event that requires people to get up and speak. Oftentimes, it may be at the local level. And really looking at what we're facing this next 12 months, decisions the council will be making on climate, we're going to need people there. And not just the regular suspects who come up and every time they come to the podium, they say, okay, they're going to talk about climate, we've heard it, blah, blah, blah. We need all of you. We need as many of you as possible. So there's a table outside. You can take the pledge. And like we said, we want you to take it seriously. What will happen is, so far we've signed up 3 organizations, Climate Action Bainbridge, CCL, and Indivisible. And there's 2 other organizations we want to sign up as well that have, a real concern and want to take action on climate. So what you'll get is something called a call to action. And then you'll be given about a 1-page synopsis of the issue. So you feel real comfortable getting up and making remarks. Sometimes the remarks you make will be nothing more than getting up and saying, yeah, I support this action on climate, thank you. So you can say as much or as little as you want to do. And you'll be given, the rules, how many minutes you have to speak, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So many of these actions are local, and for some of you, you may only want to participate in local actions. But there's also actions at the state level, lobbying, and hopefully in that case we'll have a carpool going down. CCL, as you have heard, has a big lobby event in June of this year. Boy, wouldn't it be great if a bunch of us got there and really talked to people, decision makers, to do something about a national fee and dividend program. What they're suggesting here, I don't know if you got it, it's fantastic. It would solve so many problems, just like that. So lots of opportunities, and you're desperately needed. So some of you have already signed up for this program, and those of you who have signed up know that in about 2 weeks you'll probably be getting your first call to action. Now, one thing I want to warn you about, oftentimes we have very little notice about a very important event, particularly at the local level, because agendas will change. They don't usually print their agenda going out a whole year. So you may get something that says, yes, next week or in 3 days, you need to show up at Council on Tuesday. We will also, by the way, try to tell you when it's on the agenda so you don't have to sit through a 4-hour meeting. But be prepared that some of these may be relatively short notice. We'll also include in there what we're trying to accomplish. you know, what the big issue is that we're trying to get through. So hopefully, like we say, there's a table out there. Jane and I will be there. Hopefully many of you, all of you who haven't signed up yet, will sign up. I can't, you know, this is the end result of all the knowledge that you gleaned at these forums. Doing something about it, because sitting at home and worrying, as we know, and yelling at the TV screen or the computer does absolutely no good except make you feel really bad. Taking action, doing things like this, trust me, makes you feel really good. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. Okay, I think that's a wrap. Just a reminder, donation. December, the community workshops, we really want your input into the climate action plan. So look for notices on that. It's going to go out on the city website. And thank you, everybody, for coming.